Hello and welcome to another edition of the Jack's Throwback Attack podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Good to have you with us. My name's Jack and this is my Throwback Attack podcast where I chat with some really interesting people about kids' telly in the 90s and noughties. Now, this interview is actually a two-parter. Now, the reason for that is we spoke over 2 sessions and recorded around about 2 hours of audio, so I thought to break it up into 2 chunks. The person I'm chatting to this time is Tim Edmunds. Tim worked behind the scenes on a number of iconic kids shows, with his career starting in the 1970s. It was in the 1990s with the formation of the Media Merchants, along with his business partner Neil Buchanan, where things really took off with a string of hit shows. This is a fascinating interview and I hope you enjoy it. Well, on today's edition of the podcast, I'm very pleased and very honoured to have with me Tim Edmunds. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you, Jack. I'm very good.
Good stuff. How's things down where you are at the moment?
Very sunny and very quiet, which is a perfect combination. So I live in Kent. I live about 10 miles south of the Maidstone Studios, where really I did all the great bulk of the work that I did. So all the Art Attacks were made there, all the Zzaps were made there, all the Terror Towers were made there. Yeah, it was my kind of spiritual home. So I'm not far away from there.
And it's a nice area, so good stuff. And it'd be great to talk about all those great shows that were made in that building. I'm going to head right back to the early days of your career in television. With Southern TV in Southampton. I mean, how did you start off in television?
Oh, absolutely by mistake. I was running a health food store. There you are. That's my great qualification for joining television. I was running a health food store, and one evening, a guy that I had been at college with called me up and said, "Listen, I'm working on this live Saturday morning show for kids. They're 2 researchers short. And there is nobody in the union, because television was very unionised then, there's nobody in the union who's suitable or available, and the union are prepared to accept somebody effectively off the streets on a 6-week contract. Please, would you come and have an interview with this executive producer?" And I said, "Well, I don't know anything at all about television." He said, No, that doesn't matter. Come and have a word with them. So I went in for an interview with this lovely guy called Anthony Howard. And he turned around to me and said, "I'd like you to come and do this job." And so I'd never had any thoughts or dreams or aspirations about television at all. And then suddenly I found myself in the wonderful world of telly, working on a live Saturday morning program called The Saturday Banana, which was fronted by Bill Oddie of The Goodies. And one of his co-presenters was my mate, the guy who'd asked me to go in for the job, a lovely guy called Bill Gaiman. So I went and joined telly and started researching and trying to go and find unusual things to put on the telly on a Saturday morning. So how did I get into telly? Completely by mistake.
That's crazy, because in this day and age, a lot of people have to go to university or college, or they have to have years of experience before they'll even get a foot in the door. But you were just working in a shop and you'd never done anything in TV. Yep. It's strange how different it used to be back then.
Yeah, in fact, when Neil and I were running the Media Merchants and we were employing quite a lot of people, we invariably didn't go for anybody with television experience. We went for people with the right attitude, the right approach, and because we knew that we could teach them how to make good telly. So it was always finding people with the right attitude and then teach them how to do telly.
That's great stuff. Yeah, that's a really cool thing that you do that for somebody, and it's a shame that doesn't happen more often these days, really.
Well, Nick Ayling and Triana, who run Terrific, they both came via that route into the Media Merchants because they had just had the right attitude and the right approach and the right interest, and we could then teach them how to make good television.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about those days a little bit later on. One show I do know that you had involvement with, and anybody of a certain age will be a huge fan of this show, but I know that you were part of Runaround, but that was an on-camera role for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Um, Again, not deliberate at all. So I was the researcher on Runaround, and what that meant was that I was summoned up to the executive producer's office and told, you are going to work on Runaround, which meant that you had to go and find all the schools, all the contestants, all the items, and you had to write all the questions. And that was fine. I could do all that. But the guy who presented Runaround, a comic called Mike Reed, later famous on EastEnders, for some reason he was the presenter of Runaround, but he couldn't read very well and didn't have a very good confidence in reading out these questions that I'd written. So it was necessary to have somebody there in the studio who could correct Mike in a pleasant way, because if you didn't have somebody who could correct Mike in a pleasant way on the screen, then each time he couldn't read a question, you would have to stop recording and then go back and pick it up and do it again. So this role was created for the researcher, in this instance me, to be sat in a little on-screen booth, tidying up any pronunciation on questions or whatever it may be. So I might write a question that I thought was very funny, like, who or what is Vitus gerolitis? Is he a nasty throat disease, a place in Sweden, or a tennis player? Now I thought was a reasonably funny question at the time. Well, Mike couldn't get his head around Vitus gerolitis at all. So he would then throw to me and I would pronounce it properly for him. He would then have a go at it. He'd have a go at me. It would bounce back. And it was a little bit of on-screen banter. So it was really as my role as the researcher that led to this kind of offshoot, which was having to be on screen.
And as I understand, at the moment, they're actually rerunning all those old shows, aren't they, on a channel, I think, at the moment. Have
Really?
you seen any of them?
No, I haven't. And I think they'd feel terribly dated now.
So in those southern days as well, and later on in TVS, I believe you had some involvement in an iconic kid show, How and How To as well. I was actually, a couple of years ago, I actually interviewed Gareth Jones, and he spoke about those very early days of How To, and how he was a big fan of the original. And I have to say, he had a lot of praise for you because you worked on the very early days of that, and what was the word that he said? You got it off the ground, basically, and that was why it was a success for as long as it was. What was your memories of working on those two shows?
Okay, I worked on the last ever series of How in its original incarnation. In other words, the series with Jack Hargreaves and Fred Dinenage and John Miller, and it wasn't Bunty James, Marion Davis. I think Marion Davis. Anyway, I worked on that last ever series. And How had been created by Jack Hargreaves, who was a master storyteller. And I learned a lot from working with Jack, and it was a delight to work with Fred Dinenage on that early series. So about maybe 8 or 9 years later, I was given the opportunity of reinventing How, basically, of bringing it back as How To. And the original series had been presented by 4 presenters, and the idea was that these 4 people would sit around a table and they would kind of try and outdo one another in things that they'd discovered that week. That was it, all based around the table. So when I brought back How To, I realized that the dynamic would work better of 3 people rather than 4 people. And I very much wanted Fred Dinenage to be the kind of central figure, the central storyteller, the Jack Hargreaves role. And therefore, I needed to find two people who would complement Fred. And I'd known Gareth for quite a while. I'd done Get Fresh with him. And I thought he was just an absolute first-rate communicator. So then I was left with this dilemma that, I needed a woman to balance it up, and I needed a young person. So it was Fred being the older person, two younger people, blah, blah, blah. And I was coming back from lunch one day, and somebody came and said, "Oh, you've had a phone call. You've had a phone call from somebody called Carol Vorderman." And I had a call with Vorderman, and she said that she'd heard that Hal was coming back, and would I possibly consider her for it? And so I possibly did consider her for it. And so we ended up with How To, with Fred, Gareth, and Carol Vorderman. And they were probably the happiest days I've ever spent in the studio. They were joyous. We had such fun making it, such fun. And it worked. It really worked well. So yeah, I've had 2 doses of How, one in its original form, and then this golden opportunity to bring it back in a new form.
Yeah, and I have to say, How To was one of my favourite shows, definitely somewhere in my top 10, and you could tell that there was definitely a lot of love and a lot of warmth and a lot of fun going on. I mean, when CITV did an anniversary show some years ago, there was a feature about How, and you could just feel this pride for it, and it's a show that everyone remembers. I mean, it's come back recently, which is fantastic. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it was. It really was so much fun, and something you probably don't know, because my relationship with the presenters was so strong, and I trusted them so much. What I did was I always held back the last item of the last show in a series and didn't tell them what it was and didn't tell them who was going to present it. And so it became kind of this great mystery item that was going to happen. And then at the last minute, I would take them out of the studio and then tell them who was going to present the item, not what it was. And invariably, it was Fred who was going to present it. And they went back into the studio, and it was just a complete surprise what was going to happen. And the first one I remember doing was, how can a fruit get you thrown out of a hotel? And this was a How about a fruit in Indonesia called a durian, which smells so appalling that many hotels don't allow people to come in with a durian in their bag. And so what I did was that I got 3 boxes lowered down from the ceiling. So Fred had a set of instructions as to, there will be boxes that will lower down. You are to get Carol and Gareth to open up their boxes and describe what's inside, and then blah, blah. So the How unfolded, but such was the trust between them and me that actually we could do those surprise items, and they were magical, because they just had such freshness and such laughter and warmth about them.
Indeed, and it's shown through on the programme, and I think that's why it was so loved and why it ran for so long as well. So, hats off to everyone who made it possible.
I did maybe the first 4 series of How To. 3 or 4 series, I can't remember. Then it moved up to Scotland via Scottish TV, and I firmly remained in Maidstone doing media merchant stuff.
That's fair enough. Well, thank you for being part of the genesis of the programme, and it continued on without you, but still worked. Based on what you'd created. Well, partly created as part of a team. It's all good stuff.
And it's still a brilliant format.
It is.
It would work today. Well, it did work with Terrific, doing a different version of it, but the essence of it is still workable.
Absolutely, and there's always, even in this day and age where you can get the answers for anything on a computer, I think there's still a first for it being on television, and at least, making learning fun and enjoyable, and not too boring. So,
quite a lot of it was basically about storytelling, about throwing out the how. How on earth do you do this? Well, let me start by telling you this. So you're drawing the viewer along to the answer so that they are discovering it for themselves. And that's the magic of the format.
Absolutely. Very true indeed. In those southern days as well, moving on to a different side,
Yeah.
In those southern days, I believe that is when you first met Neil Buchanan. Is that right?
Not quite. I first met Neil. Okay. When Southern lost their franchise and this new company called TVS came along, TVS wanted to do a Saturday morning program. And I was charged with putting an advert into Melody Maker and The Stage, looking for new talent. And this advert in the papers went, "Have you ever had breakfast with a gorilla?" And that was to try and draw people's attention and get them to send in a photograph and a funny story or whatever. And Neil applied for that. And the first time I met Neil was at the auditions. He got through the first stage, the auditions, and though he didn't get the job as a presenter on number 73, he came along with some caricatures of people. These caricatures were really very good. And though he didn't get the main job, it was felt that we could use him as an occasional guest. And so I was the person that looked after Neil Buchanan, the artist from Liverpool, as an occasional guest. So I first met Neil. It must have been late 81, early 82. And so I looked after Neil in those early couple of series of number 73. And as we got to know each other a little bit better, so we realized that actually we're very chalk and cheese. I mean, really chalk and cheese, but actually that we fitted together, made each other laugh, and created stuff together. So that was really the genesis of where all the Media Merchant stuff came from an early collaboration in probably 1982.
Ah, it's a cool story. And the only reason why I asked and why I said Southern is, I mean, I might have got it wrong. I thought it was on Saturday Banana when he was in a band.
All right. He was in a band called Marseille, who did appear on the Saturday Banana Show. And I joined the Saturday Banana Show the week after his band was on. So I missed him by a week.
Ah, okay. That clears that up. Fair enough. I'm sure I'd heard it somewhere, but I can't remember where now, that it was on Saturday Banana. But no, fair enough. If it was 73, then that's all good. Obviously, Neil became a huge part of number 73 eventually, and then went on to Motormouth, and you were working behind the scenes. This was all during the TVS days when they took over from Southern in the southeast. A few years down the line, you start devising this art show for children. How did it come about?
It came about because Neil was this self-taught artist. He used to do caricatures. He did caricatures of people on the back of bus tickets and things, you know. He did it the whole time. He's an immensely creative man. Really immensely creative. And we were going to go down. Neil had a filming assignment in Cornwall. I'd set up 4 films for number 73 with Neil down in Cornwall. And Neil and I travelled down to Cornwall on the train together. And that's where Art Attack, the genesis of Art Attack was. We sat on this train and we talked about how you could go about an art show for kids in a different way that kind of attacked art a bit and made it accessible to kids like I had been, who with no artistic skill whatsoever. And we got down to this hotel in Cornwall and we had afternoon tea and we sat with our feet up, staring out at the Cornish waters, and really crystallized what we were going to try and do with Art Attack. We were going to try and make a show that gave you an attack of art, where you could attack art, where your eyeballs would be given a shock, where you could do things that you never dreamt you could do, where you could take the kid by the hand and say, yes, you can do it. And it was during that conversation also that we realized that there was a bit that we could do with Art Attack that would be quite special. We would do big scale art. We would do one piece, which was a big bastard piece of art. And that was the terminology. We sat there in Cornwall and we talked about a big bastard piece of art. And so that was the genesis of Art Attack. That was probably, God, I'd have to have a look at my notes, but what would that have been? 86, 87, 87 probably, where we had that first really formative conversation about Art Attack. That's how it came about, Jack, on a train.
Wow, and such an incredibly long time ago, and it ran for so long. I mean, what's interesting is, I mean, I have seen online some clips of the pilot show that was filmed a bit before the actual programme. But what surprises me is that there's bits that did make it in the show, like the big pictures and that, but it's set in a disused swimming baths. There's all these Monty Python style animations. Neil's wearing this garish suit and a baseball cap, and there's these comedy sketches with Richard Waits, who went on to be in Zzzap. I mean, it's nothing like the finished programme. I mean, how did you go from the pilot and then pick out the bits that worked to then form the programme that we know and love now?
The pilot was made on a shoestring. Okay, so we had to find a location, a central location to do it in. And we found this cheap swimming pool and we filled it up with purple water to make it look weird. Neil wearing a suit, it was an ultimate green suit. So it's a suit that's of a colour of green by which you can electronically change its colour whenever you wanted to. So the idea behind that was that anytime Neil, the artist, had an idea, his suit would crackle and fizz and come to life. But really, in essence, all of Art Attack was there. There was a big picture. There was Neil going out on the street, caricaturing people, interacting with them. He was showing little tips as to how to draw. So there was a lot of the DNA of Art Attack that buried inside that show, inside that pilot. We made the pilot, we edited it. It was too weird. It was too funky. So we edited it again and kind of simplified it. And then when we showed it eventually to Nigel Pickard, a very important person in our lives, by the way, Nigel said, look, just simplify it. Here's the real gems of this, these little drawing tips, this big picture, Neil's personality. So off the back of that, we kind of simplified it. And then because it was going to be made into a series, there was money behind it. And the fact there was money behind it meant that we could take it into a studio as opposed to a disused swimming pool. And the moment we could take it into a studio, we could have much more control over it. And that's how we came about this lovely environment for Art Attack, which was the giant-sized art materials. So you then got giant art materials, big pictures, Neil's personality, little drawing tips. You've almost got all of Art Attack there then. Does
Absolutely.
that make sense?
Yes, that does. And when it came to pitching it to ITV, was it something that they were really on board with straight away, or did you have to kind of fight a bit to get it? Because I don't think ITV had done a kids' art show before. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, everybody remembers Tony Hart on the BBC, but whether there been anything on ITV, I'm not sure.
No, I mean, we didn't have to fight for it because the system wasn't like that then. So we made the pilot for TVS, and Nigel Pickard, who was our champion, really, took the idea and the series through to ITV, and they liked it. They liked it a great deal. Okay, here's a story you won't have heard. How did we persuade Nigel Pickard to allow us to make the pilot for Art Attack? we created a document about it all, and we said to Nigel, we really want to come and see you about this. He said, yeah, fine. And we went into his office, and Neil laid out a pattern of A4 paper right the way across Nigel's office. And then we said to Nigel, okay, Nigel, just watch this. Neil got a pen out and drew a line right the way down this snake of white A4 paper, right to the end. Took about 35 seconds. And we said, there you are. He said, what? We said, you've just watched the tip of a pen for 35 seconds without questioning what it was doing. And he said, you're right, let's do it. That it's the power of the end of the tip of a pencil, the tip of a pen. And very often with Art Attack, there's such a joy in just watching somebody draw, not knowing what it's going to be, but you, the viewer, are following it and trying to guess what it is. Absolutely. So, in fact, to answer your question, we didn't have to fight for it. The tip of the pencil fought for it, in a way. So Nigel took it to ITV. It worked. We made 6 shows initially. Then they commissioned another 10 very quickly on the back of that, and then we were away. Absolutely, and what a beast it became over time, and we'll go all over that very shortly. Yeah. What I did want to ask, and hopefully I've got this correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when it comes to the creation of the media merchants, this is my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but when Art Attack started, it was TVS's show, but it was credited to the media merchants, which is a collective name for you and Neil. But then when TVS folded, when it lost its franchise and Meridian took over, Meridian didn't want to make it, so you created the media merchants as a production company, bought the rights off TVS for Art Attack, and Scottish Television just kind of put their name to it, but you made it still in Maidstone. Is that correct? Yeah, that's it. There's politics wrapped up in it and all of that, but yes, in essence, that's exactly right. So, and the key to it was us getting the rights back. When we created Art Attack, there was Neil as a freelance person and me as somebody who was employed by TVS. So the rights to Art Attack were owned 50% by Neil and 50% by TVS. A very clever guy who worked for us went and negotiated with TVS and eventually got my 50% of the rights back for the sum total of £1. Wow, okay. So then Neil and I jointly owned 100% of Art Attack. So that's when the media merchants could really start working on it properly. In those early days of Art Attack, when you were creating the show and you were working as the producer, you mentioned the set with the giant props, which I thought was fantastic. I have heard that the creation of that had something to do with Neil literally dropping art materials on the floor. Is that right? It's a good piece of folklore. It's not quite true. We used to work at his house or my house a lot, and one day we were round at his house and we were trying to figure out what the set was going to look like, what it was going to look like, and we were both lying down on the floor. There were art materials everywhere, all around, and that's when Neil then said, "Hold on, what would happen if he?" And he actually made a tiny little Neil, cutting it out of paper. Said, "What would happen if we change the scale? What would happen if we put a little Neil in amongst these materials?" And you suddenly realised that this was going to work spectacularly well if we could get somebody to build all of these art materials on a giant scale. That was the formation of the set for Art Attack, and a really nice guy, Simon Jago, really good designer. He then took that basic idea and made very big props out of it. He subsequently won a Royal Television Society Design Award for that set, which, I always felt should have actually been shared with Neil, to be honest, but there we go. And I remember the first time we put the set in, so white studio, and in went these giant art materials. It got set over the weekend, and I went up to look at the set. I took my 3 small children with me. One was 11, one was 8, and one was 5. And I remember vividly taking them into this set, and the utter shock and awe and wonder as they went, Honey, I Shrunk the Artist. They walked into a place where the art materials were giant. It was magical. And that's what we tried to recreate in the way that we shot that set. That you always, the opening of each Art Attack, you'd see the set, you'd see it, it's just a bunch of art materials. The camera would move in towards it, and suddenly a tiny little Neil would pop out from somewhere, and you've got the shock of the size of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it looked incredible on screen. I can't imagine how it looked in real life. Some of them even actually did work for real, didn't they? Like the pencil sharpeners and that, yeah.
Yeah, they did. They did. The pencils was an obvious example. We said to Simon, the designer, look, we don't need to get something fancy made. A piece of drainage piping, paint that red, put a tip on it, and that, in essence, is what it was. It was just a very clever illusion, but nothing too fancy. The pencil sharpener, in fact, looked like a pencil sharpener, but didn't sharpen pencils at all. We made it look like it sharpened pencils.
Yeah, I'm sure I've seen a clip of Neil twisting a giant pencil in it, and there is actually a shaving coming out of it. I'm sure I've seen that.
The two aren't related. There is a pencil, there is a pencil sharpener, and there is a separate shaving that's being fed out.
Yes, but very clever indeed. And when you're a viewer and you're 10 years old, you don't think about that. You think it's really working. So that's the magic of it.
That's the joy of good telly.
Absolutely, and it certainly was. The other thing as well that was kind of iconic with the show is the red sweatshirts. The red sweatshirts didn't really come in till a few series in. I know there was a blue and a yellow, and there was denim jackets and that. But why red jumpers? Why was that the chosen look that became the look of the show?
I suppose some of it was a vehicle to show off the logo. That's the logo was a very important thing because that summed up Art Attack. Why sweatshirts? I don't know. Maybe we tried out a number of things, and in the end, it was just a practical solution. Yes, I don't think there's any big story there, man. I mean, Nick might know. I don't know.
No, that's fair enough, because the red sweatshirts were an iconic look of the show, so much so, as naughty as it is, you can buy knockoff versions online on eBay and Amazon, and people dress up as Neil for various things, like parties and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Neil for...
I've seen.
Well, I did it. I did it for Comic-Con about 5 years ago. I actually went as Neil with my own giant pencil that I'd made out of paper mache, and everybody was stopping me for a photo. So, but lots of other people have done it as well. I'm sure you've seen all the pictures that do pop up of people doing Halloween parties and conventions as Neil or the Head or Zzzap characters. I've seen a friend of mine actually went to a rave a couple of years ago, and it was 90s themed, and there was like 4 people that had dressed up as every character from Zzzap, so it lives on in fancy dress.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. We just felt that we were making not something that was important, but we felt we were making something of quality, and that we were giving something to kids. And with Art Attack, what were we giving them? We were giving them some entertainment, and we were giving them some skills. Why don't you try doing this? And if one child went away from that TV and went and tried it and realised they could do it, then that was a success in our eyes.
Absolutely. And still very fondly remembered, and I think it still will be many years from now. I mean, Tony Hart's programmes are still well remembered, and those were before Art Attack.
I have a bunch of grandchildren. I have one granddaughter who's nearly 6, and she's just got Art Attack. Not from me, from somewhere else, but she absolutely gets it. And so when she comes here, what she wants to do is she wants to watch an episode of Art Attack, and she wants to do the things from Art Attack. So it still has a basic power to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's aged in any way, because art doesn't age. There's no technology on display. I mean, the only
No.
thing that dates it slightly is, Neil's haircuts or the fact that it's in the 4:3 ratio, the early shows. But other than that, I mean, it still works, I think. I don't think you can tell much difference.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sure you're heading that way anyway. The sweatshirt became very important. The sweatshirt became very important when we did the international shows for Disney. But you know all about that, don't you?
I will get onto it in a second. Yes, there was one of my questions, the
Sure.
international ones. I wanted to ask, obviously in between all the makes, you had the head. What was the decision to have the head in the show?
The decision to have the head in the show was interesting. It was structural. What we wanted to do with Art Attack, we realised that, Neil was going to talk to you, the viewer, and he was going to instruct you in ways of doing things. You couldn't have two lots of that back to back. It would just be too much Neil, too much talking, too much telling. So we needed to have punctuation. And what we created was a double punctuation. So you go, there's Neil's item, go to the head, go to a little visual sting, come back to Neil. And as punctuation, it worked brilliantly. So why the head? What was the head there to do? The head was there to reiterate what Neil had just done in the item. And so if you needed reminding that you needed 2 pieces of paper and some toilet roll, that was the head's role to say, oh, wasn't that brilliant what you just did? And just remember, you only need 2 sheets of paper and a toilet roll. That's what his role was. And as we went along with it, the idea that the head was stupid or funny or inept or all of those became slightly bigger, so that the head became punctuation, something to remind you what you needed, and also hopefully funny. So then you've gone structurally, here is Neil's item, it finishes, you go to the head, who reminds you and is funny, then you go to a little visual sting, which just is pleasing, and then you're back to Neil. So the role of the head is quite subtle but quite clever, that it did these 3 things.
It's one thing, if anybody mentions Art Attack, you'll be guaranteed somebody go to remember the head. And I think, I know in the early series it was human actors who played the head, but the one that Francis Wright did, I think he did such a great job with that role when he was a puppet.
Oh, Francis is just a delight, super professional puppeteer, but adding immense character to the head. He'd take these stupid words that I'd written, or more latterly Nick had written, and he just turned them into something so special. He's a delight, absolute delight, Francis.
Yes, I can confirm, because we've actually met a few times. We're good friends. So the UK version of Art Attack ran for 19 series across 17 years on CITV. I know there's a lot you could talk about. We've got to try and fit it in. Could you name some memorable moments, whether that be something that happened behind the scenes that you remember, or whether that be a particular picture, or anything really that you could sum up as 1 or 2 special memories?
All studio days were happy days. They were happy days. It was a big family of people that made Art Attack, whether that be the art team, the cameraman, the guys who worked with us the whole time. Keith Hunter, wonderful cameraman. It was like a family gathering when we got together to make Art Attack. Memorable events, I suppose the money picture. The portrait of Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, that we made out of £10 notes. That was pretty memorable. Neil and I had said at the end of maybe series 2, something like that, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could make a picture out of money? And so I rang up the Bank of England And I said to them, look, this is who we are. This is what we do. They said, yes, we know about Art Attack. And I said, look, we'd really like to make a picture out of money, but we haven't got much of it. And I have it on very good authority that you've got rather a lot of it. Would you like to lend us some? And they were on for it, which was great. In the end, we borrowed £250,000 from the Bank of England, had it delivered, and one of the clauses in the deal with them was that I had to stay with the money at all times. So the money was delivered. Neil and Helen and Driana laid out the picture overnight. It was the only way that we could do it. We couldn't do the picture starting with an empty studio and building it forwards. It was the first picture that we realized you could do them backwards. So Helen and Driana and Neil laid this picture overnight. They cleared off about 2-3 in the morning, and I had to stay with it. And so I then had to sleep in the control room of, in fact, it was in the studios in Southampton, not Maidstone, but I had to sleep with the money. And about 6 o'clock, I got woken up by a security guard saying, yeah, mate, your picture's moving, don't you? Somebody had turned up at 6 o'clock and turned on the air conditioning. And so the whole picture was kind of fluttering, which was interesting. We got it corrected, and we did the picture. And at the end of the picture, the Bank of England brought in some money counting machines, and they counted all this money back. And fortunately, it was all there, all £250,000. And to my memory, it was one of the cheapest art materials we ever used, because I think we paid £58 in overnight interest on this £250,000. So that was a kind of a memorable thing. Memorable because it was a lot of money, and it was a closed studio, and everybody on the site was going, what's happening in there? What's happening in there? And but also very important because it was the first time that we realized that you could do a big picture backwards, that you could start with the end image and slowly unpick it. So that you unpicked it and then edited it forwards, if that makes any sense.
Yes, I didn't realise that. So, yeah, you've taught me something I didn't know about that picture. I mean, I've seen it several times, but I would never have thought that it was done backwards. So
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the big pictures, I mean, there were so many memorable ones and different materials. I mean, the ones that always stuck out for me that I liked, and I think most people remember, are those ones where Neil was in the completely all black studio with the salt or the lentils. I mean, the one of the dragon is probably one of my favourites, personally. Yeah. I love those ones. Those are great.
Yeah, we'd always have, in a series of 13, we'd probably have 4 studio-based big pictures, which might be a couple of pourers, as we referred to them, and maybe a painter, a big-scale painting one. But no, there was always a great variety of those. The big pictures were good fun to do. They were out on location. That was a happy band of people out on location doing those pictures. In terms of the other items, a real personal favourite of mine was lolly lettering. And lolly lettering was making fantastic calligraphy, beautiful, beautiful letters with a lolly stick. So you have a lolly stick, snap it in half, dip the rough end into ink, and then do lettering with it. It was so simple and so powerful, so effective.
Indeed. I remember it very well. I think it was one of the ones that made it onto the VHS releases, so it's immortalised forever, that one.
I think some of the other ones, there's a kind of generic batch of items that I liked a great deal, were really patterns. I'm completely non-artistic. I'm very creative, but not in the way that Neil is with pen and paper. And some of the essence of Art Attack was to take the kid that didn't think that they could do anything artistic and to show them that they could. So some of those kind of wavy line patterns that you then coloured in, or jigsaw piece patterns, I like those a great deal because they really would have appealed to the 6-year-old in me who didn't believe he could do anything artistic.
Yeah, I felt the same. I mean, I could draw to a degree, but I love doing those pattern pictures and
Yeah,
the wax crayon with the watercolour on it. So those are the
yeah.
things I like to do when I was at home, when I was drawing. So, yeah, definitely, I agree with you on that one. The other thing as well is with the big picture. I mean, it's amazing how different television was back then with the budgets. But how did you convince ITV, after Art Attack had been on a few years, that at Christmas you go off to New York or to Austria and do these extravagant pictures? How did all that come about?
Charm. Charm is how it came about. Um, Art Attack was very successful at that point, and Neil and I had a fantastic relationship with the network centre, the ITV centre, and with the people who are the controllers of CITV. And so we would go in and talk to them about trying to, here's an idea, would you be interested in it? And they go, oh, yes, please, yes, please. And so we went and talked, I can't remember who it was, maybe to Vanessa Chapman. But we said, look, would you like us to do an Art Attack Christmas special? And she said, yes, please, yes, please. And we knew that we could do the studio part of it quite easily. We could decorate the set with lots of paper chains, and Neil could wear a funny hat or whatever. We could make it feel very Christmassy. But the thing that would set it apart was if we could do a really spectacular big picture. And they bought it. They bought the idea. They said, well, look, tell us what kind of spectacular big picture you'd like to do. We said, well, we'd like to go and do Santa Claus surfing on the beach in Barbados. Okay. They said, fine. And it was almost as easy as that. Next year, would you like to do another Christmas special? Say the network centre. Yeah, okay, we'll do one. What would you like to do? Well, same sort of things last year, but we'd like to go to New York and switch on all the lights, or we'd like to go to Austria. And it was because Art Attack was being very successful, and we were quite laid back and quite charming about it, not pushy about it. They just said yes.
Wow, that's quite amazing. They stick in my mind quite well, actually, those ones, because I had all of the videos, and the Christmas one was the first one that I got. So those particular makes stick in my memory quite big, especially Austria and New York. So yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I know it wouldn't happen now, but it's amazing that they would pay to fly an entire crew off to make 4 minutes of footage for a kids show. It's amazing, but brilliant, and I'm glad I was there to be a viewer of it.
What you have to recognise is that it was a very different time in terms of finance of television. I feel very privileged to have worked in television at a time where there was money to support a good idea. You had the right to fail. And because of that right to fail, you very rarely did fail. But now, if you were to try and get a series away, if you tried to get a show like Terror Towers, for example, you tried to get that away, you would have to go and you'd have to get 20% of the money from here, 20% of the money from there. You'd be gathering the money together until you had enough money to just about make the series. Back then, you were given all the money to make the whole of the series. So it was a different time financially, and good ideas were supported.
Happy days, great days. Just a shame that they don't continue, but the landscape of TV's changed over the years.
Yeah, which is why I say I feel very privileged to have worked at that particular point in telly.
One kind of final thing on Art Attack before we move on to some other things. We did touch upon it. I mean, it wasn't just popular in the UK, it became a global thing. There was international series produced for Disney. How did that all come about?
Disney came to Neil and I and said, we love your Art Attack, we'll buy it from you. And we said, well, that's very kind of you, but actually, you know what? It's not for sale. And so they said, well, look, if you're not prepared to sell it to us, would you be prepared to make it for us? We said, well, can you explain more? They said, yes, we're about to launch Disney channels in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, Latin America, blah, 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 blah. And we need content. And we've tried to identify programs that have the same ethos as Disney. And we've identified that Art Attack is one of those. Could you make it for us in all of these different places? But we need it to have a local host. We're not going to have Neil Buchanan being dubbed or whatever. We need a local host. We need 26 episodes in a series, and we need it in 5.5 months. So he said, well, that's interesting. Well, we'll go and have a think about it. So we went away and had a think about it. And what we soon realized was that the number of people who can talk and draw at the same time is incredibly limited. It's an incredibly rare skill. So we knew that we were not going to find a Francois Buchanan or a Jürgen Buchanan or a Jose Buchanan in any of these countries. So we realized that what we would have to do is we'd have to go about it a different way. And so Neil and I broke Art Attack apart. We said, okay, what actually is Art Attack? And in the end, it's about a bit of skill and a bit of presenting. So we broke it apart that way, and we realized that we could find a presenter in each of those countries who could do the presenting bit, but we couldn't know that they could have the skill. So we had to find a different way of going about the skill. And so what we decided in the end was that Neil would do all the skill. All the skill parts of Art Attack International would be done by Neil, recorded in Maidstone, shot by me, edited by us in Maidstone. And the only thing about them is that you would never see the presenter. You'd never see Neil. All that you'd see his hands and his sweatshirt. So then we recorded all those bits, and then we brought in the foreign presenters. And the foreign presenters, all they had to do was to present. So they'd say, hey, welcome to Art Attack, or whatever it was in Spanish. Hey, would you like to make one of these? Showing some lovely prop that we've made. Would you like to make one of these? Honestly, it's really easy. It's as easy as this. Cut. And you would cut to Neil's hands and the skill, and the Spanish presenter would continue the voiceover. So he'd be saying, well, it's as easy as this. Just take a piece of paper, fold it in half, do this, that, and the other. The Spanish presenter would be wearing a red sweatshirt. Neil's hands would have a red sweatshirt. We never said these were Jose's hands, and we never said they weren't Jose's hands. The viewer made that connection themselves. So we discovered a way of making international shows based on breaking Art Attack apart and having some presenting, some skill done by Neil, quality guaranteed, presenting done by Jose. That's how it came about. And in the end, we made, Nick would know the answer to this, I think we made about 1,200 episodes, 1,200 episodes of International Art Attack in 9 different languages over a period of time. Every one of those was shot in Maidstone. Every one of them had the full art team support. Every one of them was lovingly edited. Every one of them was lovingly dubbed, all in Maidstone, and it went off around the world.
It's an incredible story and very, very clever indeed. And I have watched some of the, I mean, I don't understand the language, but because it's recreating the makes from the British version, I know what's going on anyway. But it is very clever and very well done. And I do know that there's a huge affection for it around the world as well, through the posts I've done online and that. So that's really cool.
Though tiny bits of it had appeared in different forms before. You know, I know that we referenced a Delia Smith cooking show when the close-ups of the hands chucking things into the saucepan begged the question, are those Delia's hands or are those somebody else's hands? So the little tiny bits of what we eventually ended up doing maybe had been done in different places, but nobody had done this on a full-blown international production line. And it was, so we kind of naively created this new form of making television internationally in Maidstone.
Well, that's it for part one. I do hope you've been enjoying the chat so far. As I said earlier, this is a two-parter. The next episode and the final one of this set will be the second half of this interview, which will be out soon. Expect discussions about Zzzap, It's a Mystery, and many other Media Merchant shows. Until then, I've been Jack, and this has been the Throwback Attack podcast. Goodbye.